And the United States would not have seemed as hostile to the Soviet Union as it was with Truman. And Truman's blunt, plain. His autobiography was plain speaking. Okay, so this whole document versus understandings thing. This is what I was talking about before. Okay, we had the Declaration of Liberated Europe. We had the Declaration of Poland. We know what we see those words. So do those documents mean exactly what it was said, or what kind of understandings were there? So the history of the origin of the Cold Wars is still a subject of considerable not so much speculation, but it's all about your interpretation of things. People who, it was especially popular in the late 60s and 70s when there was a huge negative reaction about our involvement in the war in Vietnam and so forth, to take a revisionist point of view about the Cold War and say, the United States hadn't acted so hostile after 1945, the Soviet Union wouldn't have had to be as harsh as they were with their domination of Eastern Europe and so forth and so on. Well, I didn't believe that stuff now. I don't believe that today. I think that Stalin knew what he wanted to do all the time, and if you Western guys, if you need this kind of language for publication in order to make this palatable to your people, fine. But I think Stalin knew exactly what he was going to do in those Eastern European countries, and he did it. And I don't think there's anything that the policies of the United States or Great Britain could have done to prevent him from doing it, unless, of course, what? Unless we want to go ahead and fight World War III. So you've got Churchill, Stalin, and Truman at Potsdam in 1945. The whole atmosphere was different. It was much, even though Germany was defeated and what they're meeting in basically a suburb of Berlin with devastation all around them. There was really no agreement at all. And so basically they agreed that they would agree to what they already agreed on before. But Truman is already raising issues with Stalin about what you're doing in Poland. And so Churchill, of course, lost the general election in Great Britain during the Potsdam Conference and literally had to go home and was replaced by the new Prime Minister Clement Attlee in mid-conference. And I only mention that because this is becoming sort of a bipolar world. You've got the Soviet Union and their allies, the United States and their allies, and the British really aren't. Nothing was agreed on at Potsdam that hadn't already been agreed on. So in other words, they made no progress on resolving the problem about Germany or figuring out, okay, what is it you've done in Poland, Mr. Stalin, and is that free elections, based on the will of the people, and so no. Again, the whole demilitarization, denazification had already been discussed at Potsdam. We got to get all the Nazis out of government positions and so forth. They can't be, they can't run the railroads or operate the telephone lines, and that had already been decided. We're going to insist on unconditional surrender of Japan. There'll be an Allied Control Council for Germany, which again, this is just we're just repeating what we already said. We're going to divide Germany into 4 zones of occupation, so, obviously, if you're going to do that, then it has to be governed. So, there'll be an Allied Control Council, and U.S., Britain, France, Soviet Union will all have representatives on its Allied Control Council, and all decisions, have to be unanimous. These are the Nuremberg trials, and I think I showed this picture to you the other day. So here are the zones. And so you can see that Berlin was completely in the Soviet zone. That becomes an important geographic fact for later. So this is the Soviet zone. Great Britain got this part. France got the part that was adjacent to the French border, and the United States got this part. Roughly, with the exception of France, this corresponds to what forces were where when Germany surrendered. So the Russians had already advanced across and captured Berlin and so forth, and we had driven in from the south, and down here is where the Battle of the Bulge was fought. and the British were more oriented toward the north.
They also divided Berlin, right? They also divided
Right, Berlin was also, since it was Germany's capital at the time of the war, it was decided that there would be four-power control of Berlin. So the U.S., Great Britain, Soviet Union, France all have a section of Berlin, but Berlin is completely inside the Soviet zone. That's also an important fact. Thanks for reminding me about that. So here are the four sections of Berlin. All right, so let me just put all four of these up here. And so here are your causes of the Cold War, which I do think are important, especially if you're writing about what Yalta or one of these other things about the impact that this or that had on the emergence of the Cold War. Salience is just a term that refers to something that like stands out. Like in military terms, this would be like a salient right here. So something that protrudes out. So that means, of course, that after World War II, there was no balance of power in a traditional sense, where you've got a number of great powers, and depending on how the great powers are arranged, that creates some sort of a rough no. You've got the U.S. and the Soviet Union. That's it. You have two superpowers. So from this point on, we can use that term superpower. Please don't use superpower in reference to what Great Britain in the 18th century or any other time, unless you qualify that by saying the equivalent of a 20th century superpower. Again, think about all the other powers that would have been considered great powers before. Great Britain was worn out and bankrupt, effectively. France demonstrated in World War II that they were not a great power. Germany and Japan were in ruins. Italy had never been a great power to begin with, and so all you got is the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Why exactly did France get so much territory in Germany and Berlin?
We felt sorry for them. Plus, I have no doubt that Churchill, even though he was no big friend of the French, was thinking that 3 against 1 is better than 2 against 1.
I guess why France, or why that much, and then why that much territory, and then also why France specifically instead of maybe a commonwealth of different nations.
Well, I don't think that any of the Commonwealth countries, most particularly Canada, would have been the only one who would have had any kind of real claim, were so interested in having that kind of a presence anywhere. France obviously was still an important country in Europe, and I think that Roosevelt and Churchill understood that France would have to be an important country in the aftermath of this war, unless we're going to do what the French wanted to do to begin with, and just dismember Germany. In other words, if you think about Europe geographically, France really needed to be there to counterbalance Germany. Everybody assumed there was going to be a Germany. We're not going to do away with Germany after World War II, even though some people, of course, wanted to. Hegemony refers to what they were all angling, and again, there was no direct military conflict, but fighting over. This is the United States and the Soviet Union each had their respective missions that would go to their ideological differences, and so we had a vision of what we wanted the post-war world to be like, and so from an American point of view, that was free elections, democratic government, capitalist economy. And so that's what we wanted to see prevail in the world, and the Soviet Union wanted something very different from that. The ideological differences, I hope I've explained well. It really is not possible in the context of 1945 for there not to have been a Cold War. These are the only two great powers that are left, and their political and economic systems are so ideologically polar. There's just no way that you can have really anything other than hostility. And then, Truman and Stalin, as I've always said, if they had just met as nobodies somewhere, they wouldn't have liked each other. So if they're just two, coal miners, they wouldn't have been able to get along. historic missions, the U.S., what, this, 20th century manifest ethic, and that's my view. There are historians who would agree with me about that what we wanted to do was to, expand our model that countries should adopt, liberal constitutions like we have, and have free elections, and presidents, and congresses, and free speech, and press, and all that good stuff. Or at least until recently it used to be good stuff. Some of you know what I mean. And then the Soviet Union, of course, they felt that their system, we're on the cutting edge of history with Marxism and socialism and Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader who came to power after Stalin died, said, we will bury you. And he was speaking really in a historical sense. Our way is the new way. You guys, Adam Smith was way before Karl Marx, and so you've already, your period is done. And we're the ones who are on the rise. Question?
No.
Okay, so the Cold War, which emerged before it had a name. By the way, does anybody happen to know where that came from? It was an American newspaper man who called it a Cold War, and the name just sort of stuck. Somebody last year told me that he actually got it from somewhere else, but I don't know about that. Anyway, through 1945 and 46, in the very first part of 47, it was evident in the United States that we were not going to make any progress negotiating with the Russians about anything. They were never going to agree about a government for Germany. They were going to do what they were going to do in Eastern Europe, and there really wasn't anything we could do about it unless we wanted to take them on militarily. So, in 1947, Truman made a speech to Congress where he announced a policy that became known as the Truman Doctrine, and you must know it, and you must recognize the language of the Truman Doctrine when you see it, and it is in here in a minute. Basically, we are going to support people who are resisting, subjugation by armed minorities or external pressures. So we're going to resist any further expansion of the Soviet Union and their little communist satellite governments. And then there was an economic component of the Truman Doctrine, which was the Marshall Plan. Or I should say, I guess, an economic component of our policy, our Cold War policy. And of course, the philosophical underpinning of the Truman Doctrine was containment. Okay? The Truman Doctrine did, without exactly saying so, acknowledge there's not anything we can do about places like Romania and Bulgaria and really Poland. There's nothing we can do about that. The Soviets are the ones that have power there. The Red Army has its boots on the ground in those places, and we can't do anything about that. But we can save those places that are not yet under Soviet domination, and we're going to do that. We're going to save the Greeks. That was really what prompted the Truman Doctrine. Britain told the United States, we don't have enough money to continue to support the Greeks. And if somebody doesn't step in our place, the communists are probably going to win. And so Truman said, we're going to do it. Turkey was the other country that really brought on the Truman Doctrine. But again, Truman's doctrine had its origins, we'll talk about here momentarily. And then the Marshall Plan was basically this big European recovery program. This was all in 1947, when the Truman Doctrine was announced and the Marshall Plan was also then proposed. The problem was that, especially in Germany, there was no economic recovery, in part because the U.S. and Britain and France and the Soviet Union couldn't agree on one policy to bring about economic recovery in Germany. In the Western zones, the German economy was run on American cigarettes and Hershey bars, and that's what functioned as a currency. Because the Army provided American servicemen with Hershey bars and cigarettes. And so they existed in sufficient quantity to like be a currency, but they were also sufficiently scarce because like everybody wanted cigarettes and Hershey bars. And so that's how Germany had a barter economy. And so we can't like function like this. So George Marshall, who was Truman's Secretary of State, he proposed a European recovery plan. Basically, it was like a blank check. You Europeans get together, decide what you need to bring about your economic recovery, and we'll provide it. Totally open-ended like that. And it did not rule anybody out. Soviet Union, East European countries were welcome, and they did attend the first meeting to consider the Marshall Plan. And then, of course, at some prearranged moment, Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, and all the East Europeans, got up and marched out and claimed it was all a capitalist, plot to overthrow democracy, and they all walked out. That's George Marshall. That's George Marshall. Truman on the left. So here's your background: the Greek Civil War. And in Turkey, the Soviets were putting pressure on the Turks to give the Soviets control over the two Black Sea Straits, the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. Yes?
So was the Marshall Plan intended to prevent the spread of communism, since it didn't prevent them from wanting aid from the U.S., or did it just happen that way?
Well, the Marshall Plan was purely political. We're going to resist efforts by, and it didn't call the Soviet Union out specifically, but everybody knew that's what the intention was. People who were resisting subjugation by armed minorities, Greece, or external pressures, Turkey. There's your Bosphorus and your Dardanelles, yes.
Did that in any way contribute to the development of NATO?
Well, this is all on a continuum, so we're heading in that direction. So here's the language. Must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressure. So that's what you need to be able to recognize as the Truman Doctrine. And while it doesn't call the Soviet Union out, everybody and their brother knew that exactly what this was about. We're going to resist Soviet expansion, and the policy, though it's not stated in the speech, is containment. You guys need that back up again?
Yeah.
The whole idea of containment was developed by an American diplomat, a guy named George Kennan, whose name you do need to know.
How do you spell that?
Kennan. And he was an American diplomat who spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union. And he wrote this so-called long telegram back to his superiors in Washington and explained Soviet conduct in terms of traditional Russian foreign policy. Any czar that found themselves in Berlin and with control of all Eastern Europe would have kept control of Eastern Europe. I mean, that's what Kennan said. And he said the only thing that the only thing that will stop a further advance of Soviet expansion is a show of force. Okay, you have to stand up to the Russians. If you don't, they'll run right over you. And they said the ideological part of it, though it obviously is in play, this is not anything different than any Russian government back in the 1890s wouldn't have done. And what Truman was looking for some policy anyway, and so what? Kennan's got a great idea, and so we'll contain Soviet expansion. Please do note, and then Kennan later put it out in public and wrote this essay called The Source of Soviet Conduct, which was published in this journal called Foreign Affairs. We can resist Soviet expansion by the application of so-called counterforce. So if they give money, we give money. If they provide arms, we provide arms. If it's about what diplomacy is being fought out in the United Nations, and what we've got to take a strong stand in the United Nations. And the Soviets will respect this show of force. So what, World War II, rapid demobilization, and we got a Cold War. And so we're gonna have to keep an army in being, we're gonna have to, continue development of new weapons, and so the whole 9 yards. Okay, patient, long-term, vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. Okay, so for those of you who are writing this essay that may want to involve the Korean War or Vietnam, let me say this. Kennan was talking about the Soviet Union, and he was talking about Europe. He wasn't talking about Asia, he wasn't talking about Africa, he wasn't talking about in the Caribbean. He was what would later be known as what they call them, criminologist, like an expert on the way like Russians think. The Truman administration and subsequent U.S. administrations, though, they took containment like in a global sense. So and of course it did work out this way in the case of Korea. So when North Korea invaded South Korea, according to Kennan, we've got to respond with counterforce, which we did, and we were fortunate that we got the permission of the UN to do it, because that made us look a lot better. And it was also fortunate, and probably the Soviet Union didn't know what the North Koreans were planning to do, because the Soviets were mad because we wouldn't recognize communist China as the real China and give them a permanent seat on the Security Council. And so they were boycotting the UN when North Korea invaded South Korea. And so Truman was able to go to the UN and say, authorize, us to kick the North Koreans out of South Korea. So here's the journal that had this article in it. Okay, so here's counterforce at a series of constantly shifting geographical and political points corresponding to the shifts and maneuvers of Soviet policy. And then before the Cold War was actually over, I didn't include this part so much, but he did also say containment would promote tendencies which must eventually find their outlet either the breakup or the gradual mellowing of Soviet power. So he was pretty smart, because that's what happened. The Soviet Union first mellowed and then it broke up. But we still have Russia. So the Marshall Plan, we gave economic support to the West European countries. Again, we didn't exclude the East European countries, but they didn't want it, so they didn't. And so we built up solid capitalist, for the most part, states in Western Europe as a bulwark against Soviet expansion because, why? So just remember happy people don't become communists. So if you got a job, an income, and a home, and you can take care of your family, then you're not tempted by those kind of ideologies. Please feel free to stay if you have questions about the specific essay that you're going to write on, and I'll be happy. I have posted this in the PowerPoint about Vietnam.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you more because how you know to be important. Would you be
how do you explain? So McCarthyism had significant appeal in the United States. So what forces or factors were
So I wanted to go back to your
it was not illegal.
Yeah, it makes sense. Paragraph and like, yeah.
paragraph, role and
So I think what I would do is I would say, okay, here's American foreign policy.
No, I'm good. I only,
Like in paragraph 2, here's foreign policies after World War II, in the third paragraph, second body paragraph. And then I think that third body paragraph to say, here's where there's similarities and here's where the differences are. Right.
you're welcome.
Is tonight too late to send you my essay outline, cause I already,
No,
I
it's not,
think
definitely
I
not,
wanna change this.
definitely not.
Also Leah wanted me to ask when you're putting in the multiple choice test on her math.
I'm working on that,
Okay.
I'm working on that. I realized today that I hadn't done that, so.
You put in 170% for my multiple choice grade.
Would I?
A day, yeah. Then you took it out, but it raised my grade like 10 points. It's pretty nice.
Yeah, I did that one of my ninth graders, I gave her like 199 instead of just 100 for this project, and her grade shot up like 12 points.